Arknights Endfield has just released, and as one of the lucky few that have been fortunate enough to play through both of its betas, it has come a long way. Of its various systems, the one I've always been most interested in is combat, which I find to be both very fun and surprisingly challenging to master. To give credit where credit is due, the game does do a great job at explaining things. There's tutorials for all fundamental game mechanics and even character breakdowns that help players pick things up. But there are also things the game doesn't tell you about, one of which is animation cancelling. The short explanation is that by dodging or using skills at specific points on a character's basic attack sequence, you can cancel their recovery animations. The detailed explanation though, well, there's quite a bit to it, with concepts like sequence storage, Hitstop values, and even purposely skipping attacks being a way to get faster clears. We'll cover all that and more in this guide. Before we continue, I should mention that this video is sponsored by Griftline, the publishers of Arknights Endfield. The footage from this guide is also primarily from the Creator Access server, so there may be some differences on the release build. With that out of the way, let's start with the basics, namely final strikes. They are explained in-game, but as a refresher, every character has a basic attack string. These attacks are done by operators regardless of whether or not they're controlled, but if it's done by the controlled operator, the last hit of the string will gain the final strike property. There's three main benefits to this, the first of which is Stagger. Every final strike will build a varying amount of stagger on the enemies it hits. Considering how much more damage enemies take while staggered, and how you can make use of finishes during it, both of which hits very hard and recovers SP, prioritizing stagger build is pretty important for bursting. Keep in mind that every unit has their own final strike stagger value, which is outlined in the description of their basic attack. Characters that attack quickly, like Chen, may only build up 16 stagger, whereas a heavy hitter like Ember is building up to 25 stagger with her final strike. The second main benefit is SP. When a final strike connects, it will generate a varying amount of SP. I did say there are things the game doesn't tell you about, and this is one of them. The game does say final strikes generate SP, but not how much. Like staggers, the value is different for every character, but unlike staggers, this isn't clearly outlined anywhere. Min, for example, seems to restore around 20 SP with their final strike. Last Strike, on the other hand, gives roughly 30 SP instead. It's a lot more evident when you put the SP bars side by side. And as a stagger, we want a lot of SP. It's what fuels the cast of battle skills after all, which are crucial to do damage, apply inflictions and reactions, build ultimate energy, and even trigger combo skills. Which leads to the third main benefit of final strikes. It's the activation criteria for many skills. Zahi's combo skill requires her to use up all of her auxiliary crystal charges, which just so happens to need final strikes. Pelika's combo skill trigger requires a controlled operator to perform a final strike. The same is true for Ardelia and Laevatain, the list goes on. Last Strike's battle skill, core to her rotations and one of the few accessible ways to build cryo stacks as of the game's release, also demands final strikes. Activation criteria can be indirect too. Like Akuri's combo skill requires enemies to be staggered or hit a stagger note, and final strikes build stagger. It should be evident at this point that final strikes are a pretty big deal for getting the most out of the combat systems in Arknights Endfield, which means that the more final strikes we can do, the better a team will perform. Animation cancelling is all about doing just that, using skills to interrupt attacks at specific points just to get to final strikes faster. The reason this works is because certain actions, namely dodges, battle skills, and combo skills, do not reset a basic attack string. If you happen to be fighting an enemy, land an attack, and then dodge out of the way, the next attack in the combo is going to be the following sequence. Except that isn't quite true. What these actions are doing is actually a sort of sequence storage. If you happen to dodge and interrupt an attack before it hits an enemy, then the next attack in the combo is the attack that was just interrupted. The current sequence within a string is stored and unleashed on the next input of a basic attack. This is pretty helpful at times, as if an enemy dies before a final strike connects, or you want to change targets, you can make use of the sequence storage property to maintain the current attack and use it elsewhere. It does have a time limit though. It's somewhat generous and can be done even after multiple dodges, but if you take too long, the string will be reset. So interspersing dodges with an attack activation may be needed to keep it for long, or to take it through greater distances. Although at first this seems like a problem. Rather than getting to final strikes earlier, this is delaying them. That is, until you realize that it can work in reverse. For a sequence to be stored, the game needs to have a point in which it considers the end of an attack. One would assume this would be the point in which an attack hits an enemy and deals damage, but that isn't as straightforward as you might think. What's interesting about Arknights Endfield is that attacks have clearly defined hitboxes and enemies have clearly defined hurt boxes. If an enemy moves or is knocked out of the path for an attack, then it will miss. On the flip side, if an enemy enters within the range of an attack's arc, then they'll get hit, which means that they can be hit at the very start of an attack, long before the animation has played in full. Each and every attack has a specific point in which it is considered over, and this may or may not be tied to the time in which it is expected to hit. This is why it's possible to animation cancel even when there's no enemies to strike. If we take Ember as an example, her basic attack string is quite slow, taking around 215 frames to be cast. A big reason for this is the long recovery animation on her basic 3. So if we use a dodge to cancel out of it, we can shorten the total time it takes for her basic attack string to complete down to 205 frames, a decent improvement. This isn't only limited to recovery animations either. It's possible to cancel her basic 3 before it's even due to hit, making it so that the full basic attack string completes in only 200 frames. For comparison, Endman's full basic attack string takes around 186 frames from start to finish. So Ember is 7.5% longer, but deals almost 40% more stagger and generates 50% more SP. Of course, such a disparity would only hold true if Endman couldn't animation cancel. Naturally, attacks of long animations lend themselves better to it. If you were to try and dodge cancel out of every attack from Endman's basic attack string, it'll take longer than if you dodge cancel none of them. Paying attention to the attack animations though, and there's 2 points that invite some scrutiny. When looking at the multiplier values for the basic attack, it lists 5 sequences, but in practice there's a fair few more hits in the full string. Basic 1 is a slash, as is Basic 2, but Basic 3 is a slash followed by a thrust, and Basic 4 are a set of 2 slashes with an original information after the second. It's only after it that Basic 5, the final strike, is unleashed. If an attack has 2 parts to it, then there's a chance the endpoint might be during the first part, and sure enough, that's the case here. Basic 3 and Basic 4 can be cancelled after the first attack. If only Basic 3 is cancelled, it ends up being a 1 frame loss, far from optimal. But if Basic 4 is cancelled, then that saves 30 frames when compared to a full string. These multi-part cancels aren't unique to Endman either. Last Right, for example, also has them. By interrupting her Basic 2 after the first slash, she can shortcut straight into Basic 3, significantly reducing the time taken for a final strike. Unfortunately, not every multi-part attack can be cancelled. If Ember can cancel her Basic 3 before an enemy is even hit, Last Right isn't able to cancel her Basic 3 even after an enemy has been hit by both strikes. So when it comes to figuring out when an attack can be cancelled, there's no fixed rule. There is, however, a mechanic that has an outsized impact on the value of animation cancels, namely Hitstop. Whenever an operator isn't hitting anything, attack animations play through seamlessly. But if the attack comes into contact with the target, then a small amount of Hitstop is applied. This is a good thing for player feel, as it makes hits have impact and weight. Yet as a result, rather than taking 186 frames for Endman's full basic attack string, it takes 217, 31 frames in added delay. It's particularly apparent on heavy-hitting characters, like Ember, where striking multiple targets at different points in the swing brings with it multiple small pauses. As it turns out though, despite Ember having longer hit stops, she also has fewer of them, especially when animation cancelling her basic 3. The result is that her full basic attack string can take only 230 frames, a delay of only 27 frames. And this isn't unique to a given character or weapon type, but differs per move. Doing Endman's full basic attack string twice, without hitting anything, then doing the very same but with hit stop factored in sees a much greater increase to the time delay than initially expected. Whereas before there was a 31 frame difference from start to final strike, this increases to an 85 frame difference when stopping time as at the end of the second basic attack string. This is because the final strike itself has a higher hit stop value than regular attacks. What all of this amounts to is that almost every operator tends to benefit from cancelling their final strike. It's an even bigger advantage when factoring the delay between basic attack strings, as final strikes aren't only hampered by hit stop, they're particularly egregious when it comes to recovery animations. For some of the greatsword units, like Last Right, they can spend more time in recovery frames than they do in the wind-up and hit stop of the attack combined. So animation cancelling final strikes is 2 for the price of 1. Skip the hit stop and recovery, making for some absurdly fast attack transitions. And there's still more benefits to it. As final strikes build stagger, they often end up being the skill that places enemies in the staggered state. Unfortunately, stagger begins to decay from the moment the hit connects, but finishes, being a basic attack, can only happen after the current animation has played them full. Which means that cancelling said animation allows for a much faster link into a finisher, affording you more time to do damage. Suffice to say, there's plenty of benefits, but there is a price for it. Remember that every dodge brings with it an opportunity cost. Stamina is limited, and once it's used up for a dodge, there's a small delay before it begins recovering again. The more dodge cancels you have in a string, the more stamina gets used, and the more pauses it will have before it can build back up. Learning to prioritize which attacks to cancel out of is important to maximize stamina use. Saving 1 or 2 frames won't matter if you're then losing out on 30 frames from another attack later on. The same is true when factoring in damage. If attacks are being cancelled before they hit, then that's damage that doesn't go through. This isn't always a problem, as cycling through basic attack strings faster can still yield an increase in damage. Assuming Endman is cancelling only their basic 4 and final strike recovery frames, it's a notable DPS increase. With Ember, however, the difference between doing a pre- and post-hit cancel on her basic 3 is only 5 to 6 frames, being a significant DPS loss. Knowing whether or not it's worth cutting an attack out entirely does need some number crunching, but cancelling hit stop and recovery animations is always beneficial, presuming that you are saving time and can manage your stamina correctly. But admittedly, this may not matter all that much. Basic attacks don't hit particularly hard when compared to skills and ultimates, and with how much damage can be done to staggered enemies, sacrificing basic attack damage for Stagger and SP build may still lead to faster kills. And some enemies, like Bone Crusher Vanguards, make the decision for you. Sometimes it really doesn't matter how much stamina you're using or how much damage you're losing, encounter mechanics can make a quick stagger be the #1 priority. There are ways to get around stamina costs though, one of which is swap cancelling. The game treats swapping as a high priority move, meaning you can interrupt basic attacks as well as battle and combo skills. Thankfully, it does not interrupt ultimates, with operators casting them in full. Unlike a dodge, there's no sequence storage to be had, as changing operators will always be a full reset to an attack string. This does limit how useful it can be in general play, but it also makes it an ideal cancel option for final strikes. As fast as dodges can be, there's a reason Endmin doesn't get much benefit out of cancelling their basic 3. Dodges take time. Swapping though has no animation. It's an instant replacement of the controlled operator, making it technically the fastest final strike cancel when considering time between strings. It also consumes no stamina, allowing for a net neutral or net positive stamina spend on basic attacks, as there's fewer regeneration pauses. Despite its benefits, it does have drawbacks, as it means swapping out of an operator, possibly to one which won't have great animation cancel points or who isn't well suited to on-fielding. At the very least, since swapping doesn't stop ultimates and the latter will always interrupt an animation, the two can be combined. Use an ultimate after a final strike, swap out of it once cast, and proceed to continue attacking on another operator. It may seem redundant to do this in stagger periods, as non-controlled operators still basic attack, so it's not as if you're losing damage by not swapping, but the SP recovery from a final strike can come in handy. Not to mention that it's possible to time final strikes to land right as enemies get out of stagger. If you want to remain on an operator though, then battle and combo skills can be used for cancelling, with their immediate activations making them handy at bypassing Hitstop. And like dodges, they're capable of storing the current sequence in a string rather than resetting them. These synergize with each other too. You could use a combo skill to cancel a basic attack, then a battle skill to cancel a final strike, and a dodge to cancel the battle skill. When you put everything together, you can get some really stylish combinations. For an operator like Arclight, who has a low combo skill cooldown, it's easy to constantly weave them in between attacks or back-to-back cancels. Although it looks very cool, that's about it. And I don't mean it in terms of rotation, electrification, buff uptime, resource management. That's besides the point. Even if battle and combo skills can be used for animation cancels, they themselves have animations. As the controlled operator is the only one that can build up the final strikes, every single moment that is being spent not cycling through basic attack strings is technically a damage and resource loss. Going through the exact same motions with the exact same gear and skills, but with Avywenna being controlled instead of Arclight, and she's able to kill more than 2 seconds faster. It's no contest. There are normalizing gimmicks, like the time stop that occurs when a combo skill is used, but for those that take a long time to cast, like Arknights, it doesn't last for the full skill duration. I will be covering all of the intricacies of time stop, be it the good, the bad, and the ugly, so why not subscribe and ring the bell to be notified for my future video on the topic. Either way, the point I'd like to make is that when fully min-maxing, even if combo skills and battle skills can be used for animation cancelling, it doesn't mean that it's good to do so. Relying on dodge cancels tends to be better, or if you're particularly interested in optimizing, swap cancels use battle skills only on non-controlled operators. But as with everything else in this video, there are caveats. Some operators demand fuel time, like Ember, who needs to get hit to trigger her combo skill and battle skill stagger bonus. Operators with fast skills, like Endmin, don't lose too much from weaving them in between attacks. And then there's operators whose skills don't even have animations when they're being controlled, like Last Ride. But I digress. The specifics of which operators should be controlled and when is beyond the scope of this video. Before we close, it's worth talking about Laevatain. She's in the thumbnail, and don't worry, I'm not bamboozling you, it's not just for clicks. Coincidentally, she's one of the characters that gets the most benefit out of animation cancels. I won't cover her kit in detail, but if you're not familiar with it, she revolves around melting flame stacks and her ultimate. Whenever an enemy has a heat infliction on them, landing a final strike will consume it and build a melting flame stack for every infliction absorbed. Alternatively, she also builds a stack with her combo skill. These can then be used to enhance her battle skill and give her additional ultimate energy. That's a big deal because Laevatain's ultimate is really strong. While it's active, she gets enhanced basic attacks to hit very hard, with a third hit in the sequence applying heat infliction. Her battle skill is also enhanced, doing some truly mind-boggling damage on all stacks it consumed. The problem is that her ultimate state lasts only 15 seconds. It doesn't give a set number of enhanced basic attacks, it ticks down a timer instead. Only Laevatain's battle and combo skills pause it momentarily. There's 4 sequences in her enhanced basic attack string, and in the allotted time, it's possible to do 4 of them in full, with the occasional battle skill and combo skill for more damage. If you think about it, it makes sense. 4 loops of her basic attack string means 4 heat inflictions are built and consumed for melting flame stacks, being enough for her to be self-sufficient in the ultimate period and get all of her damage out. But in practice, that isn't the case, with her combo skill or other characters being needed. When Hitstop is factored in, she barely has enough time to get everything in, with the battle skill being cast outside of the ultimate if left for last. Thankfully, animation cancels can fix this. I did mention her enhanced basic attack has 4 sequences. Indeed, that's what it says when checking the skill description and multipliers. But if you look at the actual attacks, you might notice something familiar. It's not 4 hits, it's 5. The Enhanced Basic 2 is a 2-part attack, doing 2 slashes. And as with so many other characters, this is an animation cancel point, where interrupting it after the first hit connects will shortcut into the 3rd sequence of the string. By making use of dodge cancels to skip the 2nd hit of the Enhanced Basic 2, as well as the recovery animation of the Enhanced Basic 4, the final strike, it's possible to do 5 full strings, where usually Laevatain can barely get 4 of them in. This does mean losing out on half of an Enhanced Basic 2 in damage, but when you add up all the numbers, it's almost a 15% increase in damage from her basics. For context, in single enemy encounters, Laevatain's potential 5 gives a 20% damage increase to her Enhanced Basics, so getting 3/4 of that merely by pressing a few extra buttons at the right time is very good. Optimizations don't end there either, but rather than telling you about it, I'll just show it. As expected, all of the standard benefits from animation cancelling final strikes apply. More stagger, more SP, and more damage. But as it turns out, doing 5 Enhanced Basic loops helps set up for faster ultimate cycles too. After all, 1 more Enhanced Basic 3 means 1 more heat infliction, so Laevatain can come out of her ultimate capped out on melting flame stacks even after doing 2 4-stack enhanced battle skills, which translates into a grotesque amount of ultimate energy right from the get-go. Ideally, you'd want to do this during an enemy stagger period rather than before, but as has been the pattern for the video thus far, there are some considerations to this. The pause behavior on Laevatain's battle and combo skills only seems to work if she's the controlled operator. This is actually quite problematic as she cannot use finishes while in her ultimate state. Quick swapping to a secondary damage dealer like Wolfguard to do their finisher while Laevatain does her battle skill would be ideal. The problem is that doing so means the ultimate timer is ticking down, so doing 5 enhanced basic attack strings is no longer possible. In practice, this isn't too big an issue. Better to get 4 enhanced basic attack strings and a finisher with animation cancelling than only 3 strings and a finisher without. And honestly, since the finisher isn't being done by Laevatain, it likely isn't going to hit as hard. So if doing all of this is too complex, it's fine to skip the finisher and focus only on getting a 5th enhanced basic attack string. In fact, a full enhanced basic attack string does more damage than even Laevatain's own finisher, a good 16% even, so it's more for SP than anything else really. On the flip side, aligning everything with staggers can get difficult, doubly so because some enemies are scripted to use certain attacks, like Rodagon, who will always jump after a stagger on phase 2, causing a significant damage loss if the rotation doesn't end before it. In which case you'd be losing out on the 5th enhanced basic attack string anyway, so doing the finisher would win out. Still on the topic of ultimate timer pauses, if you try to animation cancel Laevatain's battle skill with her combo skill, or vice versa, you might be saving frames, but that comes at the cost of damage. It seems like only one pause can be active at a given time, or there's an awkward interaction between the skills, but attempting to overlap them leads to a loss of ultimate duration, making it impossible to do 5 enhanced basic loops. Being too hasty with animation cancels generally is also an issue. Like with Ember's basic 3, Laevatain's enhanced final strike can be interrupted before all of its hits connect and still progress the sequence. And like with Ember's basic 3, that's not a good thing. All of the attack's properties are loaded on its last hit, which means no stagger, no SP recovery, a sizable damage loss, and no heat infliction stack consumption. Opportunity cost, remember, not every frame saved is worth it. And much like how there isn't time to use an enhanced battle skill after the last final strike on a standard rotation, the same holds true when animation cancelling. Attempting to use a battle skill after the 5th final strike would transition into its standard variant rather than being enhanced. Not like that's a problem, as the ultimate energy recovery is still very much appreciated. Get the hang of the timings, and animation cancelling should always outperform pure button mashing. There's plenty more animation cancel opportunities and related tech in the game that I haven't covered, but now that you're equipped with the knowledge of how and why it all works, finding them shouldn't pose a problem. And to be frank, we're only scratching the surface in regards to the depth of combat in Arknights Endfield. As mentioned before, I plan on covering how time stop works, but that won't be all. Positioning and targeting systems, cool nifty techs like dodge parries, and much more is still to come. So if you are interested in learning more about fundamental game mechanics, want to see detailed character guides, or would like to hear about combat techs, why not like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell? I've got more videos coming. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.